We are opening the second session, and we have three speakers. The first one is physically not here, but spiritually is here. And this is Professor Ross Brann from, is Milton Convit's Professor of Judeo-Islamic Studies and Stephen Wise Presidential Fellow, Cornell University, where he has taught since 1986 and served 20 years as chair of the Department of Near Eastern Studies. Brann is the author or editor of books and essays on intersection of Jewish and Islamic culture. His latest publication is Iberian Moorings, Al-Andalus and Sepharad and the Tropes of Exceptionalism, University of Pennsylvania, 2021. Professor Brann will speak about Ibn Gabirol's original literary persona, a fresh intertextual examination of Aṭeh, Tova, adeh, u-lvash geonim. Bakasha, please.
It's 4:30 a.m. here in Ithaca, so I'm going to start with an emendation. Namti v'nirdamti v'agea kamti. And I actually have another emendation for another poem,
Ross?
more appropriate to the proceedings. Yes?
Yeah, can you wait for one moment, please?
Sure.
Just a second, sorry.
Hi, Ross. Good morning. We're just handing out the handouts.
Oh, great. Thank you.
The handout consists of 2 pages, double-sided.
While you're doing that, I can give my other emendation, more appropriate. Bimei ha-COVID asher lo nigmaru.
Okay, you're welcome to start, Ross.
Okay. Moses ibn Ezra famously lionized Solomon ibn Gabirol as a wunderkind for his uncommonly gifted mastery of language, poetry, and philosophy. He draws attention specifically to Solomon's youth 3 times in his brief passage, with comments beginning like, Wahad al-Fatah. Ibn Ezra also alluded to Ibn Gabirol's inner turmoil and the apparent disparity between his quest for intellectual enlightenment and spiritual repose, and the defiant rage he expressed towards his contemporaries, along with disdain for life in society. وإن كان من فلاسفة طبعا وعلما وقد كان لنفسه غضبية على عقله سلطان لا يملك والشيطان لا يمسك. Ibn Gabirol's improvement of the moral qualities, about which we'll hear from Ehud a little later, encourages the reader to foster characteristics such as humility, contentment, and modesty, as opposed to haughtiness, anger, and impudence. A statement in the book's introduction presents the author as though he embraced his guidance to the letter. Quote, "For my aim in composing this book was not to benefit him who surpasses me in talent at this time, since I do not lay claim, God forbid, to superiority in the department of science. Verily, the fruit which I have plucked from wisdom is my knowledge that I am not wise, that I must not abandon the counsel of my contemporaries, and that I must acknowledge to them my weakness," end quote. This humble self-assessment is a far cry from the Ibn Gabirol we encounter in his social poetry, in which he professes his own unrivaled genius while seething with contempt for society and bitter resentment against individuals who disapprove, disagree, or disappoint. Of course, the poet-thinker was under no obligation to present us with a consistent self-portrait, given the universal human inclination for self-contradiction and compartmentalization, to say nothings of the complexities of the literary imagination and the ambiguities of artistic production. Nevertheless, ever since Klausner formulated the puzzle of Ibn Gabirol, literary and intellectual historians have grappled with the ostensible incongruence between his intemperate and unconventional social lyrics, numinous devotional and liturgical poetry, and profound philosophical opus in order to paint a cohesive portrait of him. And here a shout out to Menachem, who I believe is there, for characterizing the prevailing approaches to the supposed conundrum of Ibn Gabirol's work. No serious reader of Ibn Gabirol's poetry, sacred and social, doubts that it is informed by his epistemology and metaphysics. A strictly literary perspective provides us with another, arguably conclusive way of dispensing with the notion of the enigma of Ibn Gabirol. Don Pagis referenced the speaker in Ibn Gabirol's poetry, quote, "which is torn between hate, fear, and pride, but miraculously triumphs over himself. We may, however, identify him with the author," end quote. Tova Rosen detailed how Ibn Gabirol incorporated elements of Job into the cast of his character, and I expect we'll hear more about that from Ariel very shortly. Rosen also delineated the lyrical themes defining Ibn Gabirol's poetry. Quote, "suffering, pain, illness, death, and loneliness, the tragic aspiration to attain the truth and acquire wisdom, the conflict between the intellect and emotion, and the conflicting feelings of accomplishment and failure," end quote. Following Pagis's cue, but disagreeing with his conclusions, Raymond Shinlin observed that Ibn Gabirol crafted a hauntingly idiosyncratic image of himself, quote, "insistently self-pitying, aggressively hostile, and negative towards everything but his own quest for wisdom, contrary to the ideals of the age," end quote. So Ibn Gabirol's most informed readers, and there are others, thus identified the Gabirolian voice we encounter in his poetry. The full implications of this insight require us to consider that persona is as much a literary device as the poet's frequent interlocutors. In other words, the I in these poems is as much a literary device as the voice of others we hear speaking to the poet. The poet, his sources of inspiration, and creative sensibility are so frequently self-referential subjects of his lyrics that the larger-than-life, quirky literary persona Ibn Gabirol fashioned authorized him to deploy irony, dissimulation, and artifice for artistic effect. To put it another way, Ibn Gabirol's literary imagination served as a vehicle for portraying the poet as he wished to be perceived. We might wonder then whether the figure of this defiantly idiosyncratic speaker was fully formed and stable from the outset, or whether it evolved over the course of Solomon's apparently brief life. Fortuitously, Ibn Gabirol supplied us with a few signs to identify the initial layer of what became the eccentric, deeply troubled literary persona specialists observe. In the course of rereading the Qasida panegyric Aṭeh va'adeh u-lvash ge'onim, I noticed certain catchphrases pointing to its close conceptual relationship with lyrics Ibn Gabirol produced as a 16-year-old youth. Oops, what happened here?
Ross, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Could you just enlarge we're seeing the slide and all the small slides on the left.
Okay, I'm moving that because I can't, with the controls down. Oh, wait a minute, maybe I can. No, I can't do it. Sorry. Let me just pause the share for a minute.
Okay. That's great.
Great.
Could you just move to the next slide so we'll see it works well, and then I'll stop bothering you. Have you switched? Because yeah, great, wonderful. I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead.
In particular, Aṭeh shares certain expressions, thematic turns, tones, and figures with poems Hatil Agle Enosh Yachid Bedorot, Ani Hasar, and to an extent, Militzati Bedagati Hadufa. There's an oblique mention of age in Tehillat El, also from his 16th year. And the cluster of themes that I'm going to talk about, I'm only going to give the most salient examples this afternoon for you, this morning for you, and very early morning for me, which do not appear frequently or in the same form, if at all, in later compositions. Also, Halo Tir-i Zaman, composed when Ibn Gabirol was only 16, represents an important counterexample to what I'm going to discuss that is somewhat more indicative of the mature poet's voice. And this actually strengthens the argument that I'm making. This little cluster of poems affords us, I think, a glimpse of an early stage in the development, in the diachronic development of Ibn Gabirol's voice as a speaker in his poems, in the process of formulating his literary persona. Let's just, you have the whole poem there, but just to help you, if you're not familiar with it or haven't looked at it in a long time or ever, I'm just going to break it up into its constituent parts, and it'll help you follow the rest of my argument. Aṭeh's introduction spans nearly 3/4 of its 99 lines. It's comprised of an imagined friend's advice to the poet and the poet's lengthy, multi-layered response. The first 71 lines offer emblematic expressions of the precocious poet-thinker's intellectual, spiritual, and artistic resolve and orientation, his utter disdain for his inferiors, and his unequaled bombast. The poet stages an exchange between himself and a friendly figure whose encouraging counsel opens the poem, but who then falls silent almost as soon as he speaks. And Tova is also written about the dialogue in Ibn Gabirol's social poetry, and Ariel has written about it in some of his religious verse. The poet's sweeping rejoinder combines tazallum, zuhd, hijab with an abundance of fakhr over the course of the next 70 verses. And here you see how it breaks down. I'm especially interested in part 2 and in part 3. And here's the end. A thorough analysis would demonstrate how the lyric's syntactic markers signal thematic and conceptual shifts. It would draw attention to the poet's efforts to adapt and develop figurative language and luminous imagery from biblical Hebrew to allude poetically to his epistemology and metaphysics, while more or less adhering to Arabic-style conventional conceits. And sometimes it's more and sometimes it's less. So too, a full discussion of this poem would assess whether other Hasidah panegyrics reveal a similar dialectic between complaint, diatribe, boast, and praise. I'm going to follow, as you have in your hands, the Brodie Sherman edition. I acknowledge, of course, that this the textual transmission of this poem is very problematic, but for my purposes, I'm relying on Brodie Sherman, and in a longer version of this paper, we'll discuss also the variations or the variants. So just so you can see it again, this is what we're going to be looking at. What are the most prominent affinities between Aṭeh and the poems Ibn Gabirol composed during the earliest stage of his career, in which the text itself identifies the poet as 16 years of age? Three interrelated motifs and associated turns of phrase stand out. The poet's dedication to divine wisdom from his youth, the poet's commitment to asceticism as the path to divine wisdom ever since his youth, and the youthful poet's assertion of his uniqueness as a poet and as a thinker. Now, the translations, with my apologies to Peter Cole, whose luminous translations we're going to hear about in a little while later today. He didn't translate this poem as far as I know, so I'm relying on Raymond Shinlin's translation for some of these lines. So first of all, the poet's dedication to divine wisdom since his youth. You'll notice I guess it's not exactly highlighted. I meant to highlight it, but the second half of verse 11 from Aṭeh, Levavo van kemo ben Hashimonim, I am the youth who's still unborn, was wise as someone 80 years of age. We hear this in several poems. And the well-known kind of coming out announcement from Ani Hasar, V'libi van kelev ben Hashimonim, I've only 16 years, not one day more, but wisdom like a man who's lived fourscore. Asceticism is the path to divine wisdom ever since the poet's youth. Aṭeh v'adeh u-lvash ge'onim v'hinachem v'heref miyagonim. Deck yourself in glory and clothe yourself with grandeur and take comfort, enough with misery. This obviously is the advice that's being given to him. And it then continues, and here I think I have highlighted it, V'dom im babechi talin, v'kaveh halo takum v'laboker rinanim. If you lie down in tears, be still, have hope, tomorrow you will awake to sing. And then the poet's response, not using the same language except in verse 7, some of the same language. So you can look at the repetition, this phrase that occurs in every one of this cluster of poems, some variation on the idea of levavi min orai in the second verse of the poet's response. And then in the second iteration of the friend's comments, Uma betza behitkatzef aval dom v'kaveh ki lechol makat terufa. You'll see why this is important in a minute. Then the young poet's assertion of his uniqueness, mostly from Hatil Ad Le'enosh. Let me get to it here. V'da ki hinecha yachid bedorcha v'shircha kecharuzei tzavronim Again, that's from Aṭeh, part of the friend's advice to him. And then from Hatil Agle Enosh Yachid Bedorot. You see the repetition of the same language, and of course, repetition of Uvachar be'emunah mi bechurot. So, to go back just for a moment to Militzati, like Aṭeh, but in reverse order of speakers, Militzati B'dagati employs the Gabirolian dialogic framing device with intertextual references to quite a few poems in which the poet defends himself before interlocutors who question his ambition, his orientation, his isolation, or his arrogance. Here, the poet professes his contemplative and sublime otherworldly preoccupations. The unidentified companion then echoes the friendly advice offered at the outset of Aṭeh by encouraging and otherwise mildly chastising the poet, since he is far too young to adopt such a perspective on life. Yedidi haleven eser v'shisha svod uvchot aleyom ha'asifa. You're just 16, my friend. Is this the time to weep and mourn about the day of gathering? And that's when the poet then gives the response, repeating some of the words. Back to the uniqueness, so that we remember that. And you see the poet and the instruction given to him. So how does the poet's literary persona in Aṭeh and the 16-year-old's compositions compare with the fully realized character's voice in later personal lyrics? What emblematic Gabirolian conceptual elements are not represented in the early repertoire? To a certain extent, the aggrieved poet's blistering complaints of intellectual and artistic isolation among ignorant folk, unaware of their limitations, are matters of degree and intensification over time. However, the tenor of the poet's complaint, tirade, and boast as poles of an external struggle in Aṭeh bear little resemblance to the poet's subsequent depictions of an internal battle and an epistemological crisis, his sense of abject failure and despondent resignation, his harrowing consciousness of complete dependence on God to attain true felicity, and his embrace of various torments, all as critical components of his literary identity in the Gabirolian canon. Consider, for example, poems like Lu Hayta Nafshi, Nichar Bekor'i Geroni, Ke'evi Rav, or any of the poems devoted to Ibn Gabirol's physical illness. In Aṭeh, by contrast, the empowered poet's intellectual, spiritual, and artistic conviction instrumentalizes his verse as his armature. Note how verse 46 provides a direct response to the lyrics' opening advice. Ve'ashir shir yisamma hanifashot ve'halevavot yichaletz miyigonim. I sing a song that makes men's souls rejoice and gets their hearts surcease from sorrow. In addition, the structure of the poet's response to the friend's advice, especially the extensive third section, lines 26 to 73, conveys the poet's, dare I say it, optimism, uncharacteristic of the thoroughly pessimistic Ibn Gabirol in his prime. He overcomes every obstacle in his path on the high road to wisdom, learning, understanding, and knowledge, to linguistic, literary, intellectual, and spiritual illumination. To sum up, diachronic reading of Ibn Gabirol's social poetry, where it's possible, in a limited way, reveals a poet radiating self-confidence, avowing to attain transcendent wisdom, to dismiss quotidian ephemera, and practice literary brilliance from the very outset of his calling. The young poet neither represents his relentless quest as an insurmountable challenge in which he's entirely dependent on God, nor renders his unredeemed suffering as a critical element of his literary persona. Reading Ibn Gabirol's earliest personal poems thus uncovers a dynamic tension between the brash young poet's cast of his successful dedication to enlightenment and anticipation of supernal illumination, and the mature, despairing poet's screeching depiction of his pursuit as doomed to fail and what his literary art cannot fully attain. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Ross, and thanks to the development of all this possibility to hear you and to be with you from afar. The questions will be at the very end of the session. Our second speaker is Jonathan Decter, is the Edmund Safra Professor of Sephardic Studies and also the head of the Humanities Division at Brandeis University. His two books are Dominion Built of Praise, Panegyric and Legitimacy Among Jews in the Medieval Mediterranean, and Iberian Jewish Literature Between Al-Andalus and Christian Europe. Jonathan will talk about Those Who Worship Other Than You, Ontology and Plurality of Religions in Keter Malkhut.
So you can share, so it's in a different window. That's what I want.
Guys, everything clear to the people at home? You can see the screen. First, thank you so much to the organizers. This has been wonderful so far. The eighth canto of Solomon ibn Gabirol's Keter Malkhut briefly presents a position on non-Jewish religions that I believe is unique among medieval Jewish thinkers. Within general reflections on God's unity, Ibn Gabirol conveys that, quote, those who worship other than you, ovdei biladecha, including, it would seem, idolaters and polytheists, knowingly or unknowingly direct their worship toward the one true God, though they err in their execution. The passage reads in part, you are God of gods, Lord of lords, ruler of what is above and what is below. You are God, Eloah, and all created things bear witness to you, and in honor of this name, everything created is bound to serve you. You are God, Eloah, and all things formed are your worshipers and servants. Your glory, kvodecha, is not diminished because of those who worship other than you, for the intention of them all is to reach you. The passage goes on to say that those who seek that which is not God are misguided and fall into a trap. They are like the blind, whereas God's proper worshipers are like the sighted. This brief remark on the plurality of religions has received little scholarly attention, either in the context of Ibn Gabirol's philosophy or in medieval Jewish thinking about religion. And when it has been with rather vague reference to Ibn Gabirol's religious tolerance through the lens of Enlightenment perspectives on religion. In an article from 1977 on the sources of Keter Malkhut, Raphael Lowy drew attention to the similarity in outlook between Ibn Gabirol and the quote-unquote professions of universalism presented within the epistles of the Brethren of Purity. Summarizing the epistle's outlook, Lowy quotes the scholar A.L. Tiboui, who wrote, "The brethren of purity believe that the truth is one without its being the private work of anyone. God has sent his spirit to all men, to Christians, to Muslims, to blacks as to whites." More recent scholarship on the brethren, including important articles by Jan Matilla and Michael Epstein. I'm not sure if Epstein is here. I know he's, oh, you're online? Hello, good to meet you. I was very excited to see that you were here. Has looked more deeply at their thinking on religion. As far as I know, the only scholar to link the passage in Keter Malkhut with specific sections of the epistles is u-lvash, who also introduces a later poem by the Andalusi Ibn Asir al-Batalyaosi on similar themes. My purpose today is to look at the passage from Keter Malkhut, as well as other poems by Ibn Gabirol alongside the epistles, in order to further delineate what Ibn Gabirol meant by his terse remarks. My argument is that Ibn Gabirol's position is not the product of interreligious tolerance or a broad universalism that espouses the equivalence of religions, but rather is simply a logical conclusion required by his ontological system. First, a few notes about the Hebrew. The phrase of biladecha, those who worship other than you, evokes the use of bilad in several passages, all in Deutero-Isaiah, in which God pronounces that there is, quote, no God apart from me, emne biladai. Yet the pairing of those who worship with other than you, of biladecha, most clearly echoes those whom the Quran calls alladhina ya'budun min dunallah, those who worship other than God, that is the kafirun. Also, Chaim Shearman introduces an interesting emendation which substitutes the word bikahal for biglal. Hence, kvodecha lo yachsar bikahal uvdei biladecha. Your glory, kavod, is not diminished in the community of those who worship other than you. Although I found no clear evidence to support Shearman's emendation, it does remain interesting. Finally, we should consider, is that large enough? Finally, we should consider the precise sense in which Ibn Gabirol intended the words kavod and yachsar in kvodecha lo yachsar. Is it in the sense of honor? That's how most people read it, meaning that God's respect or reputation does not suffer by the mere fact that some people worship other than him. Or might it mean praise? That is, the worship of God is not diminished when idolaters worship others. Or, especially with Shearman's emendation, his praise is not absent from the community of non-monotheists. Or finally, could it be used, and more remotely, I think, in the sense of that aspect of the divine that dwells in the supernal realm and becomes manifest at specific moments, as when God's kavod descended upon the tabernacle and so forth. I translated it here as divinity, for God's presence, but it's simply because I don't have a better word. My sense is that kavod is being used in the sense of praise, since the passage goes on to say that those who worship other than God also intend to reach him by their actions. Even when they worship other than him, they direct their worship toward him and seek to draw close to him. I believe this meaning is supported by other poems by Ibn Gabirol and also passages from the epistles of the Brethren of Purity. It's well known that Ibn Gabirol drew upon the epistles for much of his information about cosmology and philosophy. Yet, as Epstein has recently noted, quote, the knowledge which the Ikhwan revealed to their reader is not merely scientific and philosophical, but is also religious, salvational, and esoteric. The passage that Ratzabi compares with the 8th canto is from the lengthy 42nd epistle, which addresses why there are differences in opinions and religions, ara wa diyanat. The epistle begins by noting that religions can differ just as bodies and climes can differ, and that most people follow the practices of their parents. Diversity of belief arises from differences in human faculties of imagination and reason, as well as from different methods of dialectic and analogical reasoning. People have an innate propensity for contemplating matters of religion in the world, this life and the hereafter. And so when God sends prophets, he does so only to reinforce that which already exists in human souls. The Brethren describe idol worship as the quote-unquote oldest religion and the most widespread. As with Maimonides, it arose when humans who understood God's unity began to worship intermediaries such as angels and stars, as well as images of them. Over time, God's unity was forgotten, such that only the worship of those things the idols represented remained. Those who seek God directly without intercession are of the first rank, but those further down the hierarchy, all the way to its bottom, nonetheless pursue closeness to the one God, however misguided their practices may be. Monotheistic belief is not a prerequisite for approaching the one God through worship. And here I think that this is where the difference is between Ibn Gabirol and Maimonides. Maimonides recognized Gentiles who worshipped what they knew as the first cause, but they must have been monotheists as a prerequisite. So the epistle states, and I'm reading only the end of this passage. I know I gave you a lot of text. I highlighted what I think are the most important sections. But reading just the very bottom, they wrote, "Know that in all instances, someone who worships anything and approaches God through something is in a better state than someone who does not act with devotion, yadinu, or act with religion, toward anything and does not approach God whatsoever." As Epstein notes, the position of the Persian in the Brethren's famous debate between the humans and the animals may well summarize the author's position. Religions, opinions, and beliefs are nothing but roads and paths, niches pointing to the direction of prayer and means of access, while the goal is one. To God belong the East and the West, so wherever you turn, there is the face of God, quoting the Quran. All of this comports well with Ibn Gabirol's formulation that those who worship other than God have committed errors of reason, knowingly or not, they still seek nearness to God. The Brethren do not explain precisely how idolaters who lack any conception of the one God nonetheless seek nearness to him through their objects of worship. A number of scholars have postulated explanations for their liberal position that range from general notions of human equality to more particular points about ontology, sacred history, and anthropology. Epstein, for example, has pointed to a number of factors that likely inform their conception. These include differences in geography and climate, Ismaili conceptions of cycles and sacred history, and finally, the Brethren's Neoplatonic ontology, wherein all created beings ultimately originate and derive from God. And hence they were able to combine a liberal stance toward the diversity of religions with their personal view that Islam remained the one true faith. It's this ontological aspect of the Ikhwan's thought and its concomitant notion of divine unity that I believe most directly informed Ibn Gabirol's perspective. As is well known, in the Maqbar Chaim, Ibn Gabirol presents all creation as a hierarchically arranged chain, such that God, however far removed, undergirds and informs everything in existence. The Brethren, for their part, argued that everything created, even minerals that do not move or grow, possess a kind of soul that derives from the universal soul and that can perform unique actions, as when a millstone holds the power to crush and to grind. In this way, the Brethren account for the non-volitional actions of terrestrial beings. That which philosophers call nature, with a capital N, at-tabiyya, is present in all things. The Brethren describe nature as, quote, an angel among God's helping angels and his obedient servants, ibad, and who perform what they are commanded and do not disobey his commands, while they are on God for fear of him. All this is consequent upon God's unity, the singularity that is the basis of infinity, just as the number one is the foundation of all numbers, whose unity is not compromised by the multiplicity it generates. It is fitting that Ibn Gabirol's comments on non-human and non-Jewish worship fall within the canto dedicated to divine unity, and that it is out of respect for the name Eloah in the singular form that all creatures are bound to worship God. It's in this way that I believe Ibn Gabirol goes beyond the point that all created beings reveal evidence of God's existence and testify to him, though certainly he says this as well. But Ibn Gabirol claims that everything created is actually bound, nitchayev, to serve God, not in the sense of performing a commandment voluntarily, but at least for minerals, plants, and animals in a non-volitional sense. Because of their natures, which extend back to the one, they cannot do otherwise. Further, the actions of lower beings are subsumed by the actions of higher beings, as when plants utilize minerals and animals consume plants. Hence, the power of existing things is not only hierarchic, but also cumulative. When a volitional human worships God, the lower forms also participate in this worship. The position that those who worship other than God that they actually seek closeness to him is only the logical conclusion of Ibn Gabirol's ontological system. None of this is to say, however, that Ibn Gabirol claimed the equivalence of religions. If he agreed with the brethren that a kernel of truth can be found in every religion, he also probably agreed that there was nonetheless a right and a wrong way to understand and serve God. In numerous historical poems, Ibn Gabirol bemoans the generations that fell into the era of idolatry. He celebrates rational arguments that counter polytheistic claims. His messianic verse does not exclude acts of divine vengeance exercised against non-Jews. Although Ibn Gabirol's stance toward other religions, including idolatry, might be considered quote unquote tolerant, I would say that it is not necessarily any more tolerant than Maimonides' stance in Guide 136, which empathetically considers idolatry's origin before justifying its eradication from the face of the earth, along with its practitioners. I'll note also that the brethren's empathy for idolatry does not require that its practice should be tolerated within Muslim territory on a legal level. It's just beyond their questions. An empathetic and historical approach to the plurality of religions is not the same thing as religious pluralism. Keter Malkhut is the only text in Ibn Gabirol's corpus to make such explicit reference to those who worship other than you as seeking to reach God. Yet many other poems touch on created things as well as communities participating in the act of worship, particularly in liturgical poems that recount creation as an unfolding of emanations from God. Many of these poems open with themes drawn from Sefer Yetzirah, embrace Ibn Gabirol's emanationist ontology, and like the canto from Keter Malkhut, center on God's unity. Let's consider a few examples. And some of the linkages I'm pointing to, you can also find using the footnotes of Yardain, but there's some others here as well. So the poem Kol Shin'an V'Saraf Tamid Yisal Salucha is a rahit for Yom Kippur, wherein every being is said to praise God, beginning with the angels, human beings, Metei Haaretz, and other formed beings, Kol Yitzur, all the way down to mountains and trees, beasts and birds. Every verse begins with the word kol, which of course is a key term throughout the Gabirolian corpus, and here signifies that no part of creation is excluded. Every angel and seraph extols you always, every legion and host rings out to you forever. Every man of the earth declares you king in might. All of your works and holy ones bless you. Every formed being attests to the rock who rules over all. Every community, kahal, testifies that he is the former and redeemer. Every soul sings and every spirit offers praise. All flesh that is grass, all of their goodness like a field blossom. The poem's conclusion turns to the theme of atonement in a personal key, yet there's nothing particularistic here about Jews versus non-Jews. The inclusion of, quote, every community suggests that non-Jewish groups participate in praising God and may also support Schirman's emendation to substitute bikahal for biglal and Keter Malkhut. The next poem, Kol Bru'ei Ma'ala Umata, and if you were here last night, you heard this set to a really stirring musical rendition that made me appreciate the poem in a new way. It reads thus: all creatures above and below bear witness and speak all is one. God is one and his name is one. The poet then recounts the world's ontology with an emphasis on unity and beginning with the theme from Sefer Yetzirah. Your way has 32 paths, the 22 letters and the 10 numbers. Those who understand their secret proclaim your greatness. From them, they recognize that everything is yours, that you are God, the King that is one. In considering the created world, minds find that everything other than you is a multiple. Everything is counted by number and weight. All come from a single shepherd. From one end of the earth to the other, there are signs for you, north, west, east, and south. Heaven and earth are a trusted witness for you, one on one side, one on the other. Everything is from you bestowed. You are eternal while they are ephemeral. Therefore, every form being offers you praise, kavod, and this informs my reading of Keter Malkhut's sense of kavod. From beginning to end, there is one Father. The theme of everything in creation, going back to singularity, is of course a major theme of Ibn Gabirol's poetry on divine unity. Frequent are these references to a single Father, a single Shepherd, the number one, that's the foundation of all numbers, and so on. Yet another poem that proceeds through the hierarchy of existence is the Avodah for Yom Kippur, Elohim El Rishon V'Acharon, which is modeled after early Avodot by Yossi ben Yossi and Yosef ibn Abitor. It opens with the words, Elohim is God, first and last, and indeed the first and last word of the opening couplet is Elohim. Thereafter, the last word of each couplet serves as the first word of the following couplet, which is a beautiful way of representing Ibn Gabirol's hierarchic ontology, wherein each substance is matter to the substance above it and form to the substance beneath it. God, first and last, exalted above all heights, I pronounce your unity and call out with my throat, in the beginning, God created. God, my Lord, Lord of eternity, the hearts of my faithful testify to you. Yea, all of his works laud, behold, God exists. God is one, consecrated of old, present in the heart and not hidden. In truth, the heart teaches that everything created, that every created being comes from a single shepherd. The reader can literally follow the stages of emanation while perceiving the interconnectedness of all existence. Like other poems, this poem links divine unity, emanation as a creative act, and the themes of God's works, bearing witness to his existence and pronouncing his unity. I believe this is in the double sense that is differentiated in Keter Malkhut. Created things contain signs that prove God's existence, while the things themselves, albeit without volition, also participate in God's service and worship. I don't have time, I don't think, to read this fascinating poem by al-Batalyaosi on divine unity that Ratzhabi mentioned in connection with Ibn Gabirol. Ratzhabi already noted that there's a remarkable confluence of themes between the two texts, though he doesn't take time to elaborate at all. But I'll just note one that al-Batalyaosi, of course, was a philosopher, poet, and grammarian, lived soon after Ibn Gabirol, also spent time in Saragossa, and was similarly indebted to the Brethren of Purity. As most of you know, his book of Imaginary Circles, whose ontological system bears similarities with Keter Malkhut, also took on an important place in the history of Jewish thought. This poem exhibits remarkable confluence with the themes discussed in this paper, including God's unity, emanationist ontology, creation, revealing God's evidence, revealing evidence of God's existence, and also literally pronouncing his unity. Also that improper worship originates in flawed reasoning, and that those who worship other than God actually seek nearness to him. While we can't conclude that al-Batalyaosi knew Ibn Gabirol's work directly, this poem, together with Keter Malkhut, speaks to the impact of the epistles of the Brethren of Purity in the Islamic West, and to the unique brand of Neoplatonism that animated some Muslim and Jewish thought in Al-Andalus. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, the questions at the end, so please keep them. Our third talk will be by Ariel Zinder, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Literature at Tel Aviv University. His research interests include Hebrew liturgical poetry, medieval Hebrew literature, literary theory, and the interconnection between literature and theology. He is the author of the forthcoming Forgiving Literature, a book-long study of medieval selichot. His talk will be on Abu-Ayyūb, Ibn Gabirol's Job. Ariel,
Okay. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to speak before you among colleagues and friends. What I'll present is work in progress, which is primarily the result of a very lively conversation with students right here this past semester, and some of them are even here. So it's a double pleasure. The book of Job is unbearable. Perhaps more than any other book in the Hebrew Bible, it is a book that constantly provoked its commentators not only to explain it, but also to argue with its premise, and implicitly to argue with Job himself. Some moderns who saw Job as a hero, such as Elie Wiesel or Martin Buber, rebuked him for his meek response to God's speech. But most pre-moderns did not consider Job a hero at all. For many, from Chazal to Hermann Cohen, what was unbearable was Job's clear articulation of an unjust God. Therefore, scores of rabbis, exegetes, and philosophers wished to explain Job's woes differently and to disprove his claims of unjust suffering. For the most part, this was achieved by finding Job guilty, after all. Some made him one of Pharaoh's evil advisors. Others suggested he was carrying the blame of previous generations, yet others saw him as sinning unconsciously. Among this group of correcting commentators so intent on dealing with the unbearable notion of divine violence were also Rav Saadia Gaon and Maimonides. For Saadia, Job's woes were indeed a divine trial. But in his translation, Job's accusations of unjust divine aggression are practically eradicated. Maimonides, on the other hand, saw Job as a traditional righteous believer who had a severe lack of philosophical understanding, which led him to utter wrong opinions about God's providence. Both philosophers interpreted Job while arguing with his indignant, self-assured exclamations of innocence and anger. In an ironic fashion, these philosophers, as so many commentators before and after them, were actually following Job's friends, those whom God rebukes for being wrong themselves at the end of the book. Ibn Gabirol is perfectly situated halfway between Rav Saadia Gaon and Maimonides, both chronologically and culturally. As far as we know, he did not write a commentary on Job, but his deep concern with matters of pain and wisdom would seem to justify the following question. Who was Ibn Gabirol's Job? What form did his argument with Job take? As an answer to this question, I would like to present two arguments. First, that Ibn Gabirol indeed is arguing with Job and correcting him. Secondly, I would argue that among the members of the chorus of correctors, Ibn Gabirol was the most loving agent of such gestures. In the medieval Islamicate, were you to be called Suleiman, your kunya, your nickname, so to speak, was probably Abu-Ayyūb. Yet, if there ever lived a Suleiman worthy of that additional title, it would be Ibn Gabirol. Job's poetry echoes throughout Gabirol's poems of pain and complaint. In his lyrical introductions of the Nasib, as we saw earlier, of some praise poems, and also in key passages from Keter Malkhut. It also appears in Piyutim, but that's a whole other story. The importance of Job's personal poetry has been beautifully depicted by commentators such as Chaim Shirman, Tova Rosen, who's here with us, Adi Tzemach, Pierre Cole, and others. Based on their findings, we can point to 5 different areas of intertextual contact between Gabirol's poetry and the biblical Job. The first is simply thematic. Harold Fish has argued that any literary representation of pain and alienation ends up making Job a point of reference. Fish actually wrote this of works by Kafka and Shakespeare, yet it is true for Ibn Gabirol as well. Some of the poet's greatest work details physical disfigurement, anguish, and social estrangement, So even if the book of Job is not quoted in a Gabirol poem, the ancient sufferer from the Eretz of Utz is never far away. Second point is literary form. As Tova Rosen has showed, many of Ibn Gabirol's personal poems display a dramatic form of dialogue between a so-called friend and the reply of the poet's persona. The former offers usually banal advice, and the latter answers by sublimely defiant language. That happens in Job and in Ibn Gabirol as well. The third point would be rhetorical. There are various affinities between Job's rhetoric of complaint and that of Ibn Gabirol. The most important aspect to my mind is that these personae form of address. Both Job and Ibn Gabirol do not speak to others as they are spoken to. Their friends approach them alone in the second person, Aṭeh. Yet when each of these sufferers speaks back, their utterance is regularly addressed to that friend, to all friends, to the people of their kind, to God, and in fact to the whole world. Such multiple auditors are crucial to Job's effort to refuse any form of spiritual confinement, and the same is true for Ibn Gabirol. The fourth is wisdom, chokhmah. Job famously exclaims in chapter 12, "No doubt wisdom shall die with you," referring to his friends. And chokhmah, wisdom, is mentioned throughout the book a few times, and of course it appears primarily in many of Ibn Gabirol's poems. And lastly, shibuts, iktibas, there are direct quotes from Job and Gabirol's poems. I have to say that Ibn Gabirol is not unique in drawing on Job's lofty language. That is, if we just count the references to Job, I'm not sure he's the one that quotes Job the most. However, I believe that from a qualitative perspective, Gabirol's shibutzim from Job are certainly crucial and central. So indeed, there are great similarities. And yet, a close examination of the poems reveals that Ibn Gabirol's appropriation of Job's words and images is by no means naive. It is not only intertextual, but as Gérard Genet calls it, hypertextual. It is critical, creative, and transformational. I will offer two short examples of such critical reception. The first is a short poem that actually has nothing to do with physical pain. And the English is right here, I'll read the Hebrew. Ya lecha shachri v'nishpi, efresa kapi ve'api, אל תבהלני ואל נא תחשוב חטאי ואחפי, אזכרה שמך ואהמה כהמות ימים בזעפי, מענה נפשי להסיר זכרך מעל סעיפי, חסדך יא לא חסכתו, גם אני לא אחסוך פי. And this is Yosef Yahlom's translation. Yahlom has called this a devotional poem with an undertone of complaint. And indeed, after a seemingly standard opening, signs of strain and struggle appear. Already in the second bait, in the context of the request for forgiveness, we hear the rather rare request, Al tevahaleni, do not startle me, do not harm me or attack me. Then in the next verse, the speaker says, Ve'eheme kahamot yamim beza'api. The verse is a beautiful combination of verses from Isaiah 17 and Jonah chapter 1. It's a surprising image of one being in rage as he yearns for God. Then finally, the two last lines express devotion, but do so through strikingly negative phrases. My soul refuses to withdraw. I shall not withhold my tongue. These anxious negations make the speaker unique. His arms may be outstretched to God, but obviously his mindset is highly conflictual. He's raging, he's weary of divine severity and human forgetfulness, and he is in struggle. Upon closer examination, a further struggle can be detected in this poem, and this struggle comes to light mainly through an intertextual examination. So here is what we find. As you can see, this is a very small poem, but it bears a strong intertextual affinity to the book of Job. Now, as experienced students of medieval poetry, we know that we should be very careful when dealing with such shibutzim. The Hebrew Bible, Dan Pagis reminded us, was the central semantic repository for the Hebrew poets of Al-Andalus, and not every shibutz should figure as an important interpretive key. In fact, Pagis claims most of the shibutzim were neutral. So we should hold our interpretive horses and take a close look. Perhaps indeed we can dismiss the allusions to shachri v'nishpi, since it is only a way of describing a full day. Perhaps we can disregard the source for efrisa kapi, since it is as well a simple description of a physical devotional gesture. Perhaps we can even strike the source in Iyov for tevahaleni. Yet after all this effort at ignoring the biblical context, there still remain two profound allusions to Job that should warrant our interpretive attention. By this I mean the two closing verses with their strong negative grammar. And you can see the biblical verses in English and Hebrew. Not only do Ibn Gabirol's verses retain the force and intonation of the biblical verses, they do so while also completely reversing the performative force of the biblical utterance. What Job says in defiance and in an effort to set himself apart from God's intervention, Ibn Gabirol's speaker says in devotion and in great yearning for God's graceful intervention. Gabirol could, of course, lay out his views on devotion independently from the words of Job, but instead he chose to use those very same words with their intonation, with their strong negative sense of oath, and yet overturn Job's message. This, I suggest, is simply a scene of correction. Job says, "My soul refuses," and Gabirol quickly sets in and says that all negative fervor should be directed towards the correct path, after all. Here's another example. This poem is one that, as far as I can know, and if I'm wrong, then please correct me, has not been translated into English. So you'll have to forgive my quite mediocre translation into English. Let me read it just in the English. First, we hear an interlocutor speaking to Ibn Gabirol. Were my desire to stop or withdraw, that's his suggestion, that he should withdraw. Were my hope to end or vanish. And then later on in the poem, the persona of Ibn Gabirol returns, answers him. My heart weeps on account of my soul until my youth turns old age. What shall I do? I have meant for it to be my sword and protection. I say it is my weapon, it is my trap, it is my sin and my wound. My sin and my crime are my wisdom. I wish time would forgive my sin. Time which haunts and assaults my soul and angrily pounds upon my mind. Were I only to raise my flag, my hill would be higher than any other. Be wise, leave me be, and if you do, I will award you with my share. Yet I have not the power to ascend, even if Solomon's wisdom were my own, and yet I will rise upon the clouds, even if the underworld collects my wares. It's a pretty complicated poem. With your permission, I'll refer only to the intertextual aspect of it. So what we have here is the first verse in which the addressee is challenged, and then the reply to that challenge. The first speaker saying, were your desire, we should hear that, stop or withdraw. The first speaker is typical of Ibn Gabirol's interlocutors or friends. Unlike Job's friends, however, unlike Job's friends, Gabirol's partners in dialogue strangely do not expect him to perform some correct deed or gesture. Rather, their message is different. They try actually to convince him to relent, to abstain from any hopeful action. And then the poet answers and vows to continue his journey despite inner and outer hardships. The poem as a whole, and these verses in particular, resound with echoes from the book of Job. But again, I would argue that Job's words are introduced into the poem just to be corrected, augmented, and redirected. So you can see here the places where Ibn Gabirol is using shibutzim to Job and his version of it. Think, for instance, of the way the word pish'i appears in the poem. I'm sorry, I should have. Let me just show the Hebrew for a minute. He says, pish'i v'chatati tevunati, umi ten zemani ya'avir chatati. That's the exclamation of the speaker. or in English, my sin and my crime are my wisdom. The actual word pish'i is critical for Job, since he, after all, refuses to admit that he actually has any sin to his name. That is why Job exclaims, "How many are my iniquities and sins? Let me know my transgression and my sin. Pish'i v'chatati hodi'eni." Now, look at Gabirol's verse. First, the mere tzimud, paranomasia, pish'i v'pitz'i, my crime and my bruise. Unlike Job, Gabirol wants to bring those two together. He wants to think of the wound and the sin in the same time. Or think of the words, my crime and my sin is my wisdom. Pish'i v'chatati tevunati. This is a deliberate take on that verse that you can see here from Job 13:23. But what Gabirol does with the verse is astounding. He turns the questioning of sin by Job into an admission of sin, thus diverting the utterance and avoiding any confrontation with God. A similar corrective gesture appears in the last verse you see here. Job says in chapter 17, "V'tikvati mi yeshurena, badei sheol teradna im yachad al afar nachat." Wherefore is my hope? Who shall see my hope? They shall go down to the bars of the underworld. This refers directly to the bars of the underworld that appear in Gabirol's poems. Gabirol's speaking persona does not exclaim that he will be drawn down to the underworld. He exclaimed that he shall rise up, even if the underworld would try to pull him downward. Now, some might say that these changes to Job's words were the mere result of the marriage of those biblical phrases to a different cultural or poetic epoch, or perhaps to a different biographical narrative. I believe it was more than that. Ibn Gabirol's complaint poems were his way of joining the great chorus of commentators who were so keen on arguing with Job as they interpret his words. Like Rav Saadia before him and Maimonides after him, Ibn Gabirol could not accept Job's position, and he wished to correct it. What makes this case so interesting, of course, is the fact that Ibn Gabirol is arguing with someone who is very similar to him. Furthermore, in this case, the argument is not done in the form of exegesis or a philosophical tractate, but rather in Job's own form of choice, namely poetry. The full scope and nature of Ibn Gabirol's poetic argument is well beyond the scope of this lecture. However, I do want to address some of its aspects, especially those that dwell on the borderlines between poetry and philosophy. I believe we can point to 3 points of disagreement worth mentioning here. One disagreement between Job and Ibn Gabirol has to do with sin and transgression. Ibn Gabirol does not accept the possibility of a sinless man. In fact, for Gabirol, as for many others of his time, admission of sin is a first step in the correct spiritual way. Second, activity and passivity. As I mentioned earlier, unlike Job, Gabirol fashions friends who advocate release or despair and not action or repentance. So while Gabirol retains the basic scene of adversity between two speakers, he shifts its terms and makes his speakers stubbornly insist on relentless and spiritual and intellectual action. Perhaps it could even be suggested that Gabirol especially advocates willful human action, which is diametrically opposed to what Job is doing, namely stubbornly waiting for God to appear or speak. And this leads us to the third point, which is the importance not only of this or that action, but the crucial significance for Ibn Gabirol of the primary act of desire, the journey. We should remember that the biblical Job refuses to narrativize his pain. He would not see it as any part of a long story. Ibn Gabirol, on the other hand, takes Job's verses of frustration and always sets them within poems with strong imagery of travel, ascent, and an overcoming of obstacles, as we heard Ross say before. Job's rhetoric serves him as justification to the digging in of his heels, or to his wish to reverse his own birth, or arrest the progress of daily routines. Gabirol, on the other hand, always addresses pain and despair with an image of journeys or of hopes of soaring skyward. If these are the main disagreements, what might be the driving force behind them? Marianne Schleicher has suggested that Ibn Gabirol, as well as others, correct Job because they fear his revolutionary theology. As striking as this suggestion is, I believe that one could actually believe Ibn Gabirol, Maimonides, and others when they present Job not as a fantastic revolutionary, but actually as one who is misguided. And I also believe that Ibn Gabirol's discontent stemmed primarily from his training as a Neoplatonist philosopher. For thinkers like Ibn Gabirol, Neoplatonism, For thinkers like Ibn Gabirol, Neoplatonism was not just quote unquote philosophy. It was a very blueprint of reality and the most meaningful and truthful repository of religious imagery. And the book of Job as a whole, and Job's poetry in particular, were practically impossible to square with such imagery. After all, were we to strip Neoplatonism from its overt argumentation and recover its most basic images of life, these would be an image of a constantly dynamic chain of being and the image of the painful yet necessary journey of the soul. But the book of Job presents a hero who actually has no wish for a journey, a hero whose pain does not drive him to ascent, but rather to death wishes and a love for ashes and earth. A hero whose defiance towards fellow humans does not drive him towards God, but rather provokes disagreements with God himself. None of this, I suggest, was compatible with Neoplatonism as a form of life. The book of Job could hardly even be allegorized in some Neoplatonist key. And we know that Ibn Gabirol did allegorize the Bible here and there, but I don't think that would have been possible with the book of Job. Job was just outright wrong and in need of correction. Ibn Gabirol was surely deeply moved by Job's language of negation, his intellectual independence, and his cries of pain. Yet when those were to enter Gabirol's own ambitious, grand poetic purview, many of Job's words, phrases, and gestures were simply in need of correction. And yet, what a loving scene of correction it is, one that only two staunch individualists can endure. One can only imagine them, two lonely and aching men, like two vultures in their cages, mumbling to their friends, "You simply do not understand." They seem so similar, but once you approach them, once you get closer, you realize they have their differences. Job defies God, and Ibn Gabirol defies fate. Job cries out, "There will be no future." And Ibn Gabirol says, "But our future is all we really have." Job says to his friends, "Do not push me." And Gabirol cries, "Do not hold me back." Such brotherhood, such uncanny resemblances, and such striking differences. Truth be told, no one would expect anything less from these two ailing giants. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wonderful talk. We are open to questions. Jonathan, and you can bring your off to life again.
Yeah. Jonathan.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you so much, the three of you, for this wonderful session. Ariel, I wanted to ask you, first of all, how do you understand the word chokhmah as used here by Gabirol? Is it wisdom that is equal to maybe Hikmah in Arabic, maybe Sophia in Greek, or is it closer to, for example, the way Shmuel ibn Tibbon likes to use Chokhmah to translate Ilm in Moreh Nevuchim, and I think that that's also Maimonides in the coda to the book. So first of all, I'm interested in how you understand the term, because you didn't touch upon Chokhmah, and I think it also touches upon the first part of that verse you quoted, because one of the question is not, I agree completely on with regard to the turnover, with regard to Chet and Pesha and in Yov, but remember also that Avon, Chet, and Pesha all undergo a dramatic change in rabbinic Judaism because the division is according to Mizid and Shogeg. And this is certainly something that Gabirol well knows. So a final point with regard to it, I'll tell you what's bothering me. I'm haunted by what Gabirol says in Keter Malkhut, u'miseter me'orcha na'asa hakol. I always feel that he has a Gnostic seduction. It's very, very careful, but I think it was heard in generations after him, and I was wondering what you feel about this entire combination.
Thanks, Menachem. I'm actually not sure. I can answer both questions, but I'll give it a try. And I think because I think both of those questions should be addressed as we're doing in this conference, sort of with group thinking. Because from my point of view, Gabirol has several words for chokhmah. He calls it bin, and his term that I like the best is he just calls it yekar. He says in Nefesh Asher Alu She'oneh al hayekar echmol, and it's clear from the context that he's referring to that special sense of intellectual ascendance. Now, are there differences between the different terms? Do they manifest differently in Piyutim? And that's a very long conversation, and which should be done, of course, as you just started to do with the context of Arabic philosophy as well. I have to say that from reading the poems, it may be that it's actually a simpler term than how philosophers use it. I think we should think long and hard about generally about how philosophical knowledge goes into Ibn Gabirol's personal poems. I think he's holding back a ton, really. If we didn't have Keter Malkhut and we had only the social poems, I'm not sure we'd know enough about Ibn Gabirol's purview. So there may be, this isn't a direct answer to your question, but I'm just suggesting that even the same word used differently and with various sort of fine tunings in various genres. I'm not sure that in the social poetry it would necessarily be different than Bina. That's my intuition. And as for the Gnosticism, I wouldn't know. You have to teach me. I mean, you can sense. Ibn Gabirol does object. I mean, his persona does object vehemently to fate and to time. This demonic sort of force of does that reach the level of I'm not sure. I don't know. So I return the question.
More questions? Oh, yes, sorry. Yes. Yes, please, Sarah. We can't hear you. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now, yes.
Yes. So thank you, the three of you, for three wonderful lectures which leave us with a lot to think. I was particularly struck by the way the three lectures touched on the way Ibn Gabirol oscillates between optimism and pessimism, and we all think about him as a dark figure, but there is another side to him that comes up. My question is to Jonathan. You pointed out the similarity or the similarity with Maimonides and the conception of a linear development of humanity starting from an error that corrects itself over generation and where everyone has the good intention. But I was struck by the similarity with another direction that Maimonides has or shows in chapter 51 of the third part of the guide, the Mashal HaArmon, the parable of the palace, where Maimonides seems to take what Ibn Gabirol says here and to accentuate the directional, more the intentional element. And the direction of the way people walk is the wrong direction. And in Maimonides' presentation, because he accentuates it, there is a finality there. They walk in the wrong direction, they won't get there. So Maimonides himself in other places finds ways to say, yes, finally they will. For example, at the end of Hilchot Melachim. But this particular Chatzar Beit HaMelech in Maimonides becomes something that where the intention is really wasted. They just won't get there because they walk in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I'd say that's correct, Sarah. Sorry, I can't see you. You're behind me. No, I mean, when I was first thinking through the problem, I noticed a lot of the similarities with Maimonides. In your own work, where you talk about Maimonides' possible knowledge of the epistles of the Brethren of Purity. You talk about it in the subject of talatuf, right? This induction by degree, right, of moving from falsehood toward correctness, and that one possible source that Maimonides may have drawn upon would have been the Ikhwan Safa. I was also really struck by the history of idolatry that's laid out in the epistles, which had more in common with Maimonides than I recognized. But I absolutely agree with you that in the end, I think the way you phrased it of directionality is absolutely right. What's striking to me about Ibn Gabirol is that pretty much no matter what one does, as long as one is worshiping something, even whether they have some knowledge that the thing they're worshiping is an intermediary between themselves and God, or whether they've lost any sense of God being a point of origination, they cannot fail but to worship toward God. One key verse I'd say that I've been tracing throughout studying this is the one that Maimonides brings up in 136 of the guides, the history of the verse from Malachi. I think it's chapter 1, verse 11, which I don't have. Actually, can I bring it up? Can I bring up my presentation again? I think this might illuminate their similarity and difference as well. So No, it's not advancing anymore. I need to move another slide. So one fascinating discussion from Chazal comes up in the Babylonian Talmud, Malkhut, and you have embedded in the conversation this verse from Malachi 1:11: "From the rising of the sun until it sets, my name is great among the nations, and in every place offerings are preserved to my name in a pure meal offering." Now, the verse itself really seems to suggest that there may be worship of the one true God outside, by Gentiles around the world. The way that it's handled in the discussion by the rabbis here is, of course, to downplay that possibility. And that's what you find in all medieval commentators also before Maimonides. Maimonides, of course, has this innovation where he says, yes, they're worshiping him, but it's because they know him as the cause of causes. I've been looking for traces of this verse in Ibn Gabirol also, and it's not entirely clear. I thought this might have been a verse he'd like to capitalize on, but he doesn't go very far with it. There are numerous places where he uses this phrase, "Mimizrach shemesh ad mavo'o," but there he's usually introducing the praise of the angels in the heavens rather than humans throughout the earth. But that's a path I'm pursuing.
Thank you. If I just may add, I think that it's now a consensus that Maimonides uses the Ikhwan Safa in more places than he would admit it. But there is also a consensus that Maimonides doesn't refer very openly to Jewish predecessors and to poets and Jewish poets and philosophers. And if I have to take a bet, I would say that the Canto 8 is something that Maimonides had before him when he composed the Parable of the Palace, because the similarity and the referential part seems striking.
Thank you. The last question is to Ross. Please, your question.
Just a comment. These were wonderful two talks. I learned a lot from both of them. Thank you so much. Ariel, back to the poem that I was talking about, Aṭeh adeh u-lvash geonim. Here, it ticks off all of your boxes of the ways in which Ibn Gabirol overlaps with Job. Theme, form, rhetoric, illusion. The only one that's missing is wisdom. Here, at the very beginning of the poem, the poet places in the mouth of his interlocutor God's words to Job. So in effect, the poet is arguing with God, since the poet in the poem rejects the advice that God's giving to Job through the mouth of the interlocutor. I think it's a really interesting, ironic illusion that enriches what you presented.
Thanks, Ross. It's actually, for more, even beyond Ibn Gabirol's poetry, many literary pieces that have strong ties to Job, such as King Lear, for instance. God's positive response is the least quoted part. It's what these authors and poets are really interested in is the actual human address to God, and the ending of the story, and we shouldn't even mention the really ending of the book of Job, where everything, it's a happy ending. That's definitely not, no one wants to deal with that because they're interested in the conflict. But you're right. In that specific poem, it is an interesting case. I could say in return that in Keter Malkhut, all kinds of interesting things are happening with Job. Among other things, he quotes Job's friends much more in Keter Malkhut than in other poems, meaning he embraces a much more sort of traditional point of view. So there's lots to be done. Yeah.
Thank you.
You done? I was gonna ask.
That's the end.
Oh, that's it, okay.
Yes, thank you very much for the three wonderful speakers and all the audience. And we are going out for lunch till 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. We respond. Yes, resume the panel at 2 o'clock.